Hello, everybody. This is Truth Toothpaste, and I'm coming to you today with a video about the world after COVID-19. Right now, we're still more or less in the lockdown state, but I really feel like it's time to start thinking about how the world is going to have changed after COVID-19 is no longer considered a major threat anymore, and we are back to some sort of degree of normalcy, or what we would call a new normal. Because there's definitely going to be some changes. It's not going to be exactly the way it was before. So here are my 5 big changes that I see coming after COVID-19. Number 1 is how the world deals with China. Now, China has always been a sort of borderline rogue nation, and we've made considerable compromises with China in the past, just due to the sort of impact that they have on the global economy, that they had a huge workforce in place. And so many of the world's companies were lured to China for their low labor costs and their lax environmental standards that would even make, your pro-business friendly Republicans blush. So China is this kind of icky, authoritarian country that doesn't really hold to its values as a communist country, but continuously abuses human rights, acts in authoritarian manners, removes even like the most basic human decency standards, like when you see how they treat their prisoners, when you see how they surveil their populations, how they handle dissent among its populations. China has always been sort of something we had to hold our nose while dealing with. And now I don't think that's going to be something that can go on any longer. I mean, we've all heard the stories of how there's millions of Muslim ethnic Chinese living in parts of the country that are essentially in Cold War era style concentration camps, where they're not allowed to leave, where they're under strict surveillance, where they're undergoing re-education and indoctrination into the Chinese systems. You know, how they've been accused of harvesting the organs of people they have executed, how they have oppressed religious minorities within their country. And then we get COVID-19. And whether you believe the mainstream story that it's a naturally occurring virus that comes from bats that just happened to be released in the Wuhan market, or if you believe that it has something to do with the Wuhan lab and where they're studying viruses, whether it was engineered or simply escaped from that facility on accident, or whether it was a intentional release. None of that really matters. I don't think the average person has the resources on hand to make an accurate determination about that one way or the other, so it's not really important. What is important is that China failed the world in its responsibilities in its response to the outbreak of the virus. That we've learned that China knew about the virus much sooner than the rest of the world. They downplayed the threat. They persecuted the original reporters, the original doctors who reported the severity of the threat of the outbreak. And then they put heavy pressure on global organizations And a lot of these global organizations like the World Health Organization are, I guess, they have this tendency to authoritarianism. And when I'm using the word authoritarianism, I'm using it in the terms of not the conventional I've got a gun at your head authoritarianism, but like I am a authority. You should listen to me because kind of a technocratic, administrative, rule by experts. And so those sort of people are always allured to governments that have complete control over the population because they see themselves as these holier than thou, smarter, superior experts that should be endowed with the rights to command you and yours and how you should live your life because of their great expertise in any given field or area. So it's sort of natural for these technocratic types to suck up to a government or to believe more strongly in a authoritarian style of government because it ultimately endows them with what they want, which is power over other people. And so you get this compromised world organization that's more concerned with staying on China's good side than they are with doing their job and alerting the world about the COVID-19 virus. So they utterly fail. China fails to be honest about the outbreak, and some of these global organizations also failed in reporting the severity of the outbreak. And that allowed it to spread globally much faster than it might have otherwise been able to. It may have been contained much easier, or at least it may have been drawn out over a longer period of time than it was because of the failed response by the Chinese. And then to exacerbate this, you've got the Chinese response, which in many cases was to deny shipments of vital resources needed around the world. The majority of the PPE, the protective supplies, the masks, gloves, and whatnot were produced within China, as many things are produced in China. And so when the proverbial doo-doo hit the fan, what did China do? Did they honor their contracts? Did they keep their supply lines open? Or did they prioritize their own security over the security of others? Now, I realize that later on, other nations had to take similar measures, but by that time, the shortages caused by China had already been made apparent. And then after the first wave of the outbreak, what did China do? They went to a sort of global posturing where they start donating the supplies to various countries. And of course, we have reports all over the world of many of these supplies being defective, getting false reports from the testing kits that have been delivered. So all around, it looks like China was trying to offload its third-rate medical supplies on the rest of the world and make it look like some sort of act of charity. So that's the situation with China. It came out that a ridiculously high percentage of our basic medical supplies and things like antibiotics, penicillin, stuff that you need stuff that has made the world a much healthier place. When people used to die of simple infections, if you don't have antibiotics, that's what happens. And way too much of it, a huge percentage of it was coming from China, and China was able to deny the rest of the world those supplies, and it's a wake-up call for the rest of the world. So that's how I don't think China works its way back into the same position that it was before. That there's serious problems within the Communist Party of China, that there's a lot of discontent, well-deserved discontent within China about how they handle the disease, and China's sort of unique social contract that the Chinese people would experience prosperity, and then in exchange for that prosperity, they would give their loyalty to the Communist Party of China. That balance, that's really threatened now. That China may, for the first time, have to endure a lengthy economic downturn, maybe on the scale of a Great Depression. And this is the first time that the Chinese government will be tested in that sort of way by the Chinese people. And whether the Communist Party of China will come out on the other side as the ruling party in China is no longer clear. The next area I'd like to cover is sort of health awareness. One of the biggest things that we've seen from the COVID-19 outbreak is a overall failure of the general health community to be prepared for an outbreak like this, and to provide timely and an accurate response to a global pandemic like this. So basically, a lot of faith that we had placed in our established medical community is going to be diminished by their lousy response to this outbreak. So what is the next step? Even if we get to the end of this, are you going to look at your doctor the same way as you did before? Are you going to be willing to take at face value the opinions of the medical community after they've been wrong so many times? Either forwarding disinfo from China, as we talked about, and underestimating the negative effects of the virus, or overestimating it in cases where, in the vast sections of the country where we've endured a massive lockdown and false estimates of millions of deaths within local communities and countries where the numbers have been overestimated. We kind of see this trend where they seem to get it wrong, and that they're acting more or less in their own self-interest rather than actually contributing towards a truthful dialogue with the public. For early on, it was downplayed, and when it hit, it was made to be the worst thing ever, and when in reality, it was something in the middle. And now, is the average person, what is the damage to the medical establishment from this outbreak, either from people who believe either way, that they were wrong or that they misinterpreted this virus? Are people going to take government suggestions or public health suggestions at face value the same way? And I'm going to say no. I'm going to say people are going to take a lot more active interest in their own health, at least when it comes to their immune system. And it's going to be necessary for them to do so, because the current state of lockdown isn't sustainable. It's clear that we're literally seeing a breakdown of society, and you're literally going to reach the point where the cases of mental anxiety, emotional states of people who have been lost their jobs, put in lockdown, have been isolated, have lost any sort of vision of the future of their lives, that has negative consequences and beyond just what happens with the economy. And so you're going to see negative health effects in the average person with increased cases of chronic diseases, people eating themselves to death, people drinking themselves to death, people overdosing on drugs, people just not able to deal with the emotional and psychological effects of the lockdown, and having that ultimately be worse than the disease itself, especially if we do try to reemerge from this lockdown and we find ourselves in an economy that isn't going to rebound quickly. And you find that the position that you had in society before is no longer there waiting for you. What is going to be the response of the average person? I think the average person does want to get back to normal, and I think there's a very limited amount of tolerance that the average person has for a continued lockdown in a situation where the COVID-19 virus is being, at the end of the day, overestimated in its deadly reach and effect. When we start seeing all of these reports of the spread of the virus being much more widespread than previously thought, which brings the overall death rate or complication rate of the virus down into a range that is much more comparable with other diseases that we don't alter our status quo for. I'm not going to do the stupid thing and say, oh, it's not as bad, is put it in the same category as the flu. Obviously, it has a much higher complication rate and death rate than the flu. But it's no longer a threat that threatens to be, say, an order of magnitude worse than the flu. So people are going to not trust these public health organizations because they got it wrong. They got it wrong on the warning, and then they got it wrong on the response. They were too late, and then they were heavy-handed after the fact. So I think people are going to take a much more individualistic approach to their health going forward. And just me personally, I think it's much more of a benefit for me to focus on boosting my own immune system to be able to deal with these flu or cold-like symptoms that you would encounter than it would be to try to hide in my home, for long stretches of time. I would rather see society operating on some sort of normal level, but people taking better care of their health in general and, say, taking supplements in order to boost their immune system so people can get back to normal. I would love it if I could sit down in a restaurant, if I could go to a baseball game or even watch a baseball game on TV, if I could conduct business as normal and go to businesses as normal, go to worship services as normal, but maybe I do want to take a little bit extra concern towards my health. Maybe I do carry my hand sanitizer with me. Maybe I do have a greater focus on washing my hands. Maybe I am taking more vitamin C, taking better care of my health in general, adding supplements that will help knock down these average colds and then building my immune system, my natural defenses, because at the end of the day, you can't hide in a hole forever. You're going to have to reemerge, and when you do reemerge, that virus is still going to be out there. So really the only thing that we can do is get back out there and have everybody get exposed to it. Now, I understand the original theory. About the lockdown was to not have our healthcare systems overwhelmed by so many complicated cases that needed intensive care, that the hospital system would become overwhelmed if we had too many exposures at once. But now we're getting this test data in. The test data says we failed essentially in stopping a widespread exposure to this, that the complication rate is significantly lower than what we thought previously, and we haven't overwhelmed our healthcare system except for in a few local isolated cases. And in those isolated cases, we don't really have a great explanation. Like, there are different strains of COVID, and some of those strains are reported to be much more virulent, much more dangerous to people than others. And so it might be just bad luck that, say, maybe Italy and Iran got a version of COVID that's a lot worse than the version the United States or other countries may have gotten. So I just see people getting hardcore into taking care of their own health, that looking after their own, because it seems like that's all you can trust right now is your own research and your own data, and because the government isn't going to ride in on a white horse and save you. And even if the government does something, as evidence from the previous action, they may either lie to you, like about the efficiency of masks. Early on, they were all saying, oh, masks don't help at all. You'll just get it through your eye and you'll get exposed to it, and you don't need a mask. And they were saying that without revealing their true motives. And their true motives were, they were saying, guess what? Masks are great, but we don't have enough of them because we didn't prepare, and we need the limited supply we have on hand for our doctors and nurses to treat these extreme cases. So you peon, you don't deserve a mask. You're not important enough to have a mask. So we're going to lie to you and tell you masks aren't good enough for you. They won't do what you want. And then, what was it, a week later, they were changing their tune on the efficiency of masks. They're like, oh yeah, everybody should wear a mask. And then after they put out the request for everybody to wear a mask, they go even further. And in some places, it's now mandatory if you go out that you have to wear some kind of face covering. So the government has gone full 360, in telling you, or 180, in telling you first that mask won't help you, no good, won't do anything, to, recommending masks, to making them required. So there's no proof here, there's no track record that government action is helpful in any meaningful way, that they either get it wrong or they get it too late. And so I see people getting into supplements and doing their own research and getting into things and looking at vitamin C, vitamin D, carbon-60, chaga mushroom, the sort of things that you can take and do on your own to boost your immune system so we can keep some degree of normality within the system, and we don't have to live our lives hidden in some kind of hole all the time. So next, we've got the topic of globalism. Now, globalism, whether you like it or don't like it, whatever your opinion is, I'd argue that globalism is dead. And what I mean by that is, let's start with the definition. Globalism was sort of a post-Cold War period where the United States was the most dominant military force on the planet. And there was this kind of push towards one world government. And that we had one set of rules, one global set of rulers, even if they weren't a global government, that multiple nations were being forced into trade pacts and agreements that would limit their sovereignty and limit their ability to protect themselves or protect their people and their industries to act in their own interests. And instead, the interests were approached purely from a global level, where nations were kind of viewed as kind of petty local administration districts instead of actual sovereign countries, where we had these massive supply lines all the way around the world. You catch a fish on the east coast of Canada, you ship it in a refrigerated ship to China to be processed because their fish processing plant is the lowest labor cost, and you can offset any transport cost with that low labor cost. And then I can ship it a third time to some other marketplace because of globalism, because there's no trade barriers, there's no trade tariffs, there's no protection of industries. And you've got one set of rules running the entire show. Officially running the show. Unofficially, we had people like China breaking the rules all the time, protecting its industries, providing, stealing American intellectual knowledge and copyrights, and then limiting access to their markets. They have luxury taxes on our goods, then demand the free access to our markets. So basically, globalism was the arrangement, but really it was the United States and the West that made the arrangement possible, and other people were gaming that global system, mainly China, to their benefit, and mostly to the America and the West's detriment. Now I kind of see that as over. Everybody is scrambling to make sure that they have their own supply of medical goods, important supplies during this crisis. But I don't think it's going to stop there. You see, you've got to be secure in all of your basic resources when something like this shuts down the economy. So if you can't secure your food supply, you have a real problem right away. And, maybe it made sense to get your food from some far-flung country before, but now when that trade route is shut down, what are your people going to do in the short term? You're going to see a massive spike in the price of food. You're also seeing right now that some places that produce food are being shut down. So you're going to see this move to local security over efficiency. We're already seeing demand from, the president and others encouraging companies to move their plants back to the United States, or even just to move them outside of China that has kind of revealed themselves to not be trustworthy. Get them out of China into Thailand, or get them back to the United States, or get them somewhere closer, that you see these trade blocs sort of forming. Like we have Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and Canada and Mexico in our trade group, but there might be some people that are left out, or there might be limits to their access based on what they're able to do. So it's a complex situation, but basically I see us moving towards a system that is much more local and much more independent to dependency on global supply chains than it was previously. And all the impacts of that, I mean, that could be its own show. But so globalism as it was post COVID-19 is over, in my opinion. Now here comes a doozy, the economy. Now, I have always been critical of the global economy. I lived through and was paying vivid attention through the 2007-2008 crisis. And if you ask me and a lot of the other critics of what happened during that time frame, all of the problems that were caused that 2008 kind of crisis, all of those situations were not solved by the responses of various governments and central banks during that time. They simply printed enough money. They created out of thin air enough money that they were able to save the big banks and the people who had made stupid investments and stupid decisions. They gave them enough money to put them back on track and give some semblance of stability back to the system. Now, the stock market went up, yes, but the stock market is becoming more and more disconnected from the real economy. And what do I call the real economy? The real economy is the gas station. The real economy is the grocery store. The real economy is a mine. The real economy is a farmer's field. The real economy is someplace where a physical good or service is produced and consumed. It's not a paper or digital contract. It's not a side bet on the economy. It's not a speculation. It's when an actual good or service that humanity needs is produced and consumed. And the ratio of the value of that real economy versus the imaginary, notional kind of financialized economy, the economy of debt, the economy of promises, the economy of like pension obligations and derivatives and CDOs and those sort of things is just getting wider all the time. And the response to in the 2008 to the crisis widened that gap. But the amount of intervention made in 2008 was small enough relative to the size of the global economy, and the actions they had taken were relatively novel for the modern era anyway, that people believed that, hey, it might work. You know, they printed a few $1 trillion, but they did it slowly over a period of years. You had QE1 and QE2 and QE3 and Operation Twist, and you had all of these various methods, and there wasn't serious consumer price inflation in the real world, and the stock market went back up and the housing market went back up. But at the same time, when you just go and bail out all of these companies, you get what is called, and I'm struggling to find the word right now, it's like misallocation, malinvestment. Malinvestment is what you get. So basically, we took all of these people and companies who made bad decisions before, who needed bailouts, who needed to be rescued, and we kept them at the top of companies. We gave them bonuses. We kept their management teams in place. We kept all of the big boys in power, and we gave them more money, and we said, here, make some more stupid decisions with this big pile of money. And so, yes, we averted the initial crisis of all of the bad choices that they have prevented before, but we started moving towards them making more bad decisions with with ever greater piles of money in the future. And all of those negative consequences that they should have suffered for their mismanagement of huge amounts of resources instead fell on to the American taxpayer and just the holder of American currency. So if you were an ordinary person that had a little bit of savings in the bank, or just an ordinary person who worked for a salary valued in US dollars, your value was diminished. The way that those big boys got their funding was by diminishing the value of your savings and your salary and your benefits. Because basically, if you create more notional wealth, more paper money is a claim on the real economy. And just creating more money doesn't produce more houses, it doesn't produce more food, it doesn't produce more cars, it doesn't produce more assets of any kind, anything material that we might need or consume. It just produces more claims on those resources. But because of where the money went initially, and the fact that in 2007 and 2008, anybody who could work was working. Anybody who was offered a job. The real economy didn't really suffer. Houses were still built, factories still ran, cars still came off of the assembly line. Compared to now, the real economy has been shut down. Your real economy has suffered. Meat packing plants have shut down. Stuff can't be shipped from one place to another reliably. I tried to send something overseas by Amazon, ship it to somebody. It took a month. What should have taken a week took a month to reach this place. So when you look at the current situation versus the past situation, yeah, we kind of snuck by the past situation without too much trouble in the real world, but that's because we divided the burden in so many ways, to young people by increasing the amount of debt that they had to suffer under, and by increasing the amount of devaluing the value of their savings and their wages. But because it was brand new, the psychology didn't break. And there's no real replacement available, short-term replacement available, because people hadn't lost faith in the US dollar. Despite the whole 2007-2008 situation, the United States was still the largest military power on the planet. And yeah, the United States has global competitors, but I don't think most people are ready to jump on board with China or Russia, considering that they pose an alternative. Are you really want to accept a European Union alternative? Are they united enough? We've seen Brexit, we've seen Italy, we've seen Catalonia, we've seen all these places kind of want to leave the euro because it's not structured very well. It's not really responding to the will of the people there. It's not really, they aren't a single entity. They have this dream over there, but it's not really working out. So even though the United States and the global economic system really screwed up in 2007 and 2008, there was nobody realistically in there that could step into the gap and fill that situation. So we saw a big spike in the price of gold because a bunch of more paper money was created, and paper money does not create wealth. Wealth is the real stuff. It's the stuff you get for money. So all you do in the end is increase price inflation. And we didn't see it then because all the money went to rich people. And what do rich people do when they get money? Well, what went up in price? Mansions went up in price. Classic cars went up in price. Fine wine went out in price. So the gap between the richest people and the rest of us widened during that time. That's what happened in 2007 and 2008. Now we're getting a situation like this again with the COVID-19. Now, to be fair, the economy was already on shaky ground before COVID-19. All the way back in September and October, you started getting rumblings of this thing called the repo crisis. And the repo crisis was there were banks that needed overnight liquidity. They needed money. They needed cash overnight, and they needed it fast. And they couldn't find anybody to give it to them. They were having to pay higher and higher interest rates for these overnight loans that they weren't getting in the past, that they were able to get cheaply before, and they weren't able to. And that was a sign of banks not trusting each other. And so the Federal Reserve, the central bank, had to step in and back that whole market. And they had to, at first they said, oh, this is a temporary thing. We're just going to do it a little bit. It's not going to be that big of a deal. And then it became more and more until it just became a constant thing where billions and billions and billions of dollars rolling over on a consistent basis were having to be provided by and guaranteed by the central bank because the other banks no longer trusted each other's ability to repay each other. They were all suspicious of each other, that at any time one of these banks might go down and start a domino effect. And if they had lent them a bunch of money, they would be in a disadvantage in whatever proceedings that would happen after that. So the economy was already on shaky ground. It hadn't really been fixed. It's been 10 years. It's natural for the system to go through a rise in the economy and then a decline as we refocus the economy on the most successful things, and the things that weren't so successful, we tear them down for scrap and repurpose them for something else. That's kind of a natural cycle with the economy. We hadn't had a downturn like that in that whole 10 years. So we were already on shaky ground. And then the COVID-19 came. Well, in my opinion, the COVID-19 is not really the cause of this situation. We already earned this economic downturn. The COVID-19 was just the pin that popped the bubble. And you'll hear other people like Peter Schiff say this, USA Watchdog, if you watch Greg Hunter, Cliff High from the Webbot reports, the Alta reports. There's all sorts of people like this who will agree with me that the economy was already on shaky ground and that we had this lined up one way or the other. And the COVID-19 has only complicated what was a bad economic situation before. Well, what has the COVID-19 done to the economy? It's broken down our supply lines, our global trade supply lines like I was talking about, our global travel networks. It's shut down hospitality, it's shut down hotels, it's shut down restaurants, it's shut down a lot of retail. It's really limited a lot of people. It's destroyed demand for oil to the point that oil prices are negative, that literally if you have storage space, you can get oil for free and they'll pay you just to have the place to dump it safely. That was the kind of situation that we're in. And I'm really afraid that this COVID-19 situation is going to be used as an excuse. It's going to be used as cover to keep the same bad, incompetent, malintentioned people in power again through a whole nother economic cycle, because they'll say, oh, nobody could have seen this coming. This horrible virus, it's shut down so much of our life and our way of life, and we have to do this and that and the other thing, and we have to print so much money, and we have to give it to them. They have already, in the course of a few weeks into the response of COVID-19, printed fresh money, fresh claims on the real economy. They have handed out trillions of dollars. Trillions of dollars. Most people can't even grasp what is $1 trillion. $1,000, do you know what that is? 1,000 is a million, and 1,000,000,000 is a billion, and 1,000,000,000,000 is a trillion. Our little monkey brains can only really deal with numbers that big as an abstraction, and your ordinary person on the street doesn't understand how much is being taken away from them when their money is being devalued the way money currently is being devalued with all of these bailouts that are going to these different entities. But all of these different entities were already on shaky ground to begin with. They were already right on the verge of their shoddy way of doing business to begin with. And then this one little crisis comes along and totally annihilates them to the point that they need massive, massive bailouts in the form of trillions of dollars. Okay? That's not something that can go on long term. And the key difference is this time, it's not just a rich man's game. It's not just people who bought too big of a house. It's not just stock traders who were dealing in exotic derivatives that are affected by this. The real economy has been affected by this. Real supply lines have been broken down. When you go to the grocery store, you see the prices going up. You see empty spaces on the store shelves in many cases. Gasoline is cheaper, but that doesn't really make me feel better because I can barely, I only go one place. I can't drive. I can't enjoy my vehicle or trips or anything like that. So what good is cheap oil to me and you, right? So we have a situation where more money is being printed at a faster rate and handed out to people and handed out to regular people. Eventually these $1,200 checks are going to get down to me and you. And what are people going to do with that $1,200? It's not like giving a bailout to a rich person who just buys one big mansion somewhere. These people are going to be competing with you for basic food, basic shelter, basic transportation, basic needs. When poor people get money, they spend it on basic things. And if the supply of basic things is low, and the supply of money chasing basic things is high, what's going to happen? The price of basic goods, the things that me and you need to survive on a day-to-day basis, eventually those things are going to go up in price, especially if this free money bandwagon airplane drop keeps going on. It's like, I understand the little bit of that spark of joy you get from getting a free check from the government. It's like a drug. It's like crack. I'm gonna crack a smile when it finally gets here. If you're one of those people that's on unemployment and you kind of had a marginal shitty job that you were making $9 or $10 an hour, and you're collecting that enhanced unemployment, and you hear these stories of people that they make more money now than they had on unemployment. They make more money unemployed than they did employed because of all these extra benefits, this extra $600 that's been handed back to them. And then you hear about these stories where somebody gets a loan from the government and they call everybody back to work, or at least put them back on a payroll, pay them to do nothing, which isn't really good anyway. And they get mad because now they're getting less money than they were for getting free money from the government. And let's just be real about this. Like I said, paper money does not create wealth. Work creates wealth. Meaningful work creates wealth. If you make one giant statue of shit and it takes you a year to produce it, if it's not valuable of a year, it's not equal to the value of a year's work, you can waste your effort. But at the bottom line is, if something physical isn't being produced, you have no chance of producing wealth, right? You have zero chance. So people that are on unemployment, sitting on their butts, are just consuming. They are not producing anything. So this time around, our real economy is being affected. Our supply of basic goods is being affected, and the supply of paper money is coming online at a more drastic rate. And every round that comes out of Washington The next round is only, it doesn't take them very long for them to be back and saying, oh, we need another round, or another interest to come out of the woodworks and say, hey, we need a bailout of this other thing, like the pension system. Like, you have all of these cities and states that have made all of these elaborate promises to their teachers, to their firefighters and policemen, that we'll give them this big pension. We'll gladly pay you $2 in the future for accepting a smaller raise today. So they have spent decades promising these benefits to people, to retirees, to people who have worked in these public systems, and they have made more promises than their tax bases can support. And it's not a case of these localities not taxing enough. In a lot of cases, these are places that have among the highest tax rates in the United States. You have places like Illinois and Chicago and New Jersey. They have insanely high property taxes. They have sales taxes. They are the most taxed places in the United States, and they still have these massive pension benefit shortfalls where all of these retirees collecting all of these benefits are overwhelming their existing tax bases. And we already have those people using this crisis, using COVID-19 as an excuse to try to show up in Washington and say, hey, why don't you print up a bunch of fresh money for me too, so we can get in on this gravy train. And when they do that, that's not helping anybody either. That's not fixing anybody's problems. That's not increasing the amount of real wealth available to people. It's just stealing from some people who have saved money and giving it to other people who have not saved money. It's taking it from responsible people and giving that purchasing power to irresponsible people. And when it comes down to this, there's really only, well, I don't want to say there's only one way to protect yourself, but the easiest way you can protect yourself is by owning gold or silver. Because now you even have big banks. You have Bank of America coming out saying, guess what? The Federal Reserve can't print gold. Yeah, the government can print dollars, but they cannot print gold. And so when you've seen all of these other assets fall in price, gold is rallying. And really, I only see it's only a matter of time before silver catches on with the trend too, because as the gold price goes up, people are going to see is like, man, gold price has gone up a lot, but the silver price hasn't gone up a lot. Why aren't people buying silver? So people will make that swap to silver at some point when they can see one little tiny drop of gold that they can get or a big stack of silver. They're going to go for the big stack of silver. It's just like a psychological effect that happens. But I mean, this is no longer, people on the fringe or Austrian economists or a few contrarians saying to buy gold. This is the big bank. This is Bank of America. This is people saying like, whoa, we're printing a bunch of money and, is it going to hold its value? Probably not. History is full of making the same mistake over and over again. You have one country throughout history, they get into too many wars and they get too many debts and they lean. And yeah, they're the big dog of the world at that time, just like America is the big dog of the world right now. If you go back to the British did it in World War I. They overspent. They got in too much debt. They used to be the world's reserve currency. They are no longer the world's reserve currency because people no longer trusted them to pay their debts. Before that, you had Dutch, and you had the Spanish, and you had the Portuguese, and you had the French, and you had each one had the right combination of military power and circumstances that allowed them for a period of time, usually it's about 80 years, 100 years, where they were the big dogs and everybody else bowed to their standard because they had the system that was operating the most smoothly at the time. And now America's in that situation. Now America has took over the top dog position basically after World War One, and it's not that we are going to, realistically, there's nobody that can take that position from us, but it still doesn't mean that we couldn't see a massive devaluation in the purchasing power of dollars because of the breakdown of globalism, of the breakdown of the trade systems that we had seen in place before. So, and they're just printing massive piles of money. And when they're, it's basic supply and demand. This is economics 101. If there's a big supply of money, there's a less value can be obtained from that money. So gold and silver are now becoming more mainstream, and even big banks are making calls saying there's going to be a big price rise in gold and silver, and to get ready for inflation in basic commodities as the government keeps on handing out big piles of funny money to not just corporations this time around, but to individuals and businesses on a local level as well. And now the final kind of topic that I wanted to get into is we have millions of people in lockdown, hell, billions of people in lockdown, and a lot of these people are working from home before. Now, I have worked from home as my primary job, and I did it for years. I did it for, I'd say over 4 years for 2 different jobs. I did work from home, where I rarely went to the office, if at all. One job I went to the office one time for a meeting, and the other one maybe once a month I would go into the office. And now you have millions of people who are working from home for the first time, who are telecommuting, who are using video chats, who are doing work from their home offices, that either didn't like working from home, had some sort of prejudice against working from home, but now just the circumstances has forced them to try out the technology, right? And they're, for better or worse, people are going to get more experience with working from home. What does work, what doesn't work, what can get done, and what probably won't get done. But the net effect, I think, is you're going to see millions of people who are like, yeah, why don't we work from home all the time? Or most of the time? Why am I getting on these packed roads, paying for an expensive car, high insurance rates, hours wasted in driving commutes, all these other negative things, big costs of these office towers and places like that? If all of that wasn't necessary, if all of that additive expense isn't necessary, why don't we just get rid of it, right? Why don't we just improve our internet connections in our home offices instead of all of these expensive kind of status quo situations, right? So you're going to have a situation where a lot of people come out the other side of COVID-19 and they don't want to go back to the office. You might want to go short term, you might want to go back just to show off that you can go back, but long term you're going to go back to the traffic jams, go back to the high gasoline bills, go back to the the wasted commute times, and you're going to be like, I don't want to do this. I'd rather be at home in my pajamas. I'd rather save money in all these, suits and ties. I don't need all this fancy clothes. Don't have to do, my makeup every day if I'm a woman. All these other things that you do when you go out in public. If you can just be productive at home, why not do it that way? And that has bigger implications than you might think, because that means there's going to be less demand for office space. And if there's less demand for office space, there's going to be a collapse in the price of commercial real estate. There's also going to be less demand for oil. There's going to be less demand for cars. There's going to be less demand for everything that's a part of that system. Like, think about, there's certain restaurants that you eat at that you only eat at because they're close to where you work. There's certain shops that you only shop at because they're close to where you work. If you're already at home, would you make that special trip, or would you just walk to your refrigerator and make something for your lunch, right? So if you're working from home, your behavior is going to be different in a lot of ways than when you're working in an office. And that's going to have some pretty big impacts on the economy, which, might seem small, but it has kind of a domino effect, and it can really change the way our economy might operate in the future. Now, I appreciate it if you've made it this far through my rants with me. I just felt like I had to get out some of this information today, and I really appreciate you sticking with me through this whole thing. If you have anything you think is a big topic, a big change that's going to come into play in the future after COVID-19, it's just kind of fun to imagine what we're going to do after this, because honestly, I'm getting bored in lockdown right now, and I'm ready for it to be over one way or the other at this point. What do you think are going to be the big changes after COVID-19? What kind of world are we going to get into? Are we going to have an election this year? If we do have an election, who do you think is going to win it? And does it matter? Or is the die already cast, and no matter who we vote for president, these changes coming one way or the other? What do you think? What's going to happen after COVID-19? Drop it down in the comments below. Let's have a conversation, and maybe I'll do another kind of podcast episode. That's how long this feels like. This feels like more like a podcast than a video at this point. And maybe we'll discuss it going forward in the future. This is Truth Toothpaste signing off, and I hope you are safe and doing well. Have a great day.